This video is brought to you by GiveWell. Later this week, EU leaders are set to decide on whether to proceed with EU membership talks for Ukraine. But Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has repeatedly threatened to block Ukraine's accession bid, as well as a €50 billion aid package for Kyiv and changes to the EU budget. Last week, European leaders were left scrambling to win Orban over, with Macron hosting him for dinner and European Council President Charles Michel hurrying back from Beijing after Orban sent a letter demanding that Ukraine's accession bid be scrapped from the upcoming Council agenda. So in this video, we'll take a look at Hungary's relationship with the EU, why Orban is kicking up a fuss over Ukraine's membership bid, and whether he could actually derail it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Firstly, let's have a look at Hungary's relationship with the EU. Orban's right-wing nationalist Fidesz party has clashed with Brussels on a range of issues since it came to power in 2010, notably over democratic rights and alleged corruption. After the EU ruled that Hungary was no longer a full democracy in 2021, Orban accused the bloc of Hungarophobia and even called for the dissolution of the European Parliament. His government sees the EU as trying to impose its will on other countries, and last month it submitted a bill to the European Parliament on protecting national sovereignty to defend against what it called undue political interference by foreign groups. The biggest point of tension in the Hungary-EU relationship at the moment is over structural funds, which the EU are currently withholding from Hungary. Structural funds are basically the money the EU gives member states to support social and economic development, and they usually account for over a third of the overall budget. Last December, the EU withheld €22 billion due to Hungary over concerns regarding the rule of law, corruption and the misuse of previous funds by Orban's government, specifically EU agricultural subsidies. Another issue behind strained Hungary-EU relations is Hungary's close relationship with Russia. Orban has tried to curry favour with President Putin over the years and has repeatedly opposed sanctions against Russia since its annexation of Crimea in 2014. He's also the only EU leader to have shaken hands with Putin since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and not to have visited Kyiv in this period. Hungary-Ukraine relations were strained yet further earlier this year, when Hungary unilaterally banned Ukrainian agricultural imports in contravention of EU law. For context, in an attempt to provide Ukraine with a much-needed source of foreign currency, last year the EU removed all trade barriers on Ukrainian exports, allowing Ukrainian food to flow freely into the European single market. This didn't go down well with Ukraine's neighbours, who felt their farmers were being undercut by super cheap Ukrainian imports. And in September, Hungary, Poland and Slovakia all unilaterally blocked Ukrainian agricultural imports, sparking a row with both the EU and Ukraine. Anyway, you get the idea. Hungary has testy relations with both Ukraine and the EU, so it didn't come as a total surprise when, a month or so ago, Orban began signalling that he didn't want to let Ukraine into the EU and would veto Ukraine's accession. Originally, Orban attributed his opposition to Ukraine's accession to cultural disputes over Ukraine's Hungarian minority, roughly 70,000 ethnic Hungarians who mostly live in Ukraine's southwestern region of Zakarpattia. Orban has long criticised Ukraine for a state education law passed in 2017 that restricted the use of minority languages in secondary education. While it didn't contravene EU law, the policy was criticised by several NGOs for going against the ECHR's principle of protecting national minorities. While reports from the region suggest the sentiment has shifted away from Budapest towards Kyiv since the start of the war, in villages closer to the border, many people still feel loyal to Orban and Fidesz, who've offered more than €250 million in financial support and even EU passports to Hungarians in the area. But last Friday, in an attempt to clear Hungary's obstruction to its membership bid, Ukraine's parliament discussed a new law that would allow schools into ethnic Hungarian areas to teach all classes in Hungarian, other than Ukrainian language, literature and history. Despite this, Orban has shown no signs of relenting, with one diplomatic source telling The Guardian that Orban's apparent concerns over language rights in Ukraine were bogus and a pretext for aligning himself more closely with Putin. It's also very possible that Orban is trying to leverage his veto to get the EU to release some of the structural funds. While Hungary obviously denies this, the Commission is reportedly considering unfreezing €10 billion to try and warm Orban up. But critics have urged against this, saying the Hungarian government hasn't fulfilled its judicial reform obligations. They say unfreezing the money now would be an effort to appease Orban before the discussion of Ukraine's EU candidacy, and would set a risky precedent that would encourage misbehaving member states to leverage their vetoes to extract concessions from the EU, and ultimately weaken EU cohesion. So we've looked at a few reasons why Hungary wants to oppose Ukraine's EU membership bid, but can Orban's government actually derail it? Well, the short answer is yes, for the simple reason that accession requires unanimity amongst existing EU members, so Hungary has an effective veto. In theory, the EU could use its Article 7 procedure, sometimes referred to as the nuclear option, which gives the bloc the power to suspend a member country's right to vote. But invoking Article 7 requires unanimity amongst the other members, which definitely isn't guaranteed and could end up exacerbating EU-Hungary tensions in the long term. This is why, despite a series of long-running issues with Hungary, the EU has refrained from resorting to Article 7 in the past. This episode will probably restart the EU's internal conversation about reforming its voting processes. At the moment, lots of EU decisions require unanimity, and this makes it hard for the EU to act on controversial issues, even if they're pressing. In effect, unanimity means that the EU struggles to make significant changes to policy, and while that wasn't a big issue during the 2000s or 2010s, in today's rapidly changing political landscape, it just makes the EU look a bit slow. Unanimity also gives individual member states a lot of power, because they have an effective veto. In practice, this means that countries like Hungary can exercise significant influence on overall EU policy, even though they represent very much a minority opinion within the bloc on issues such as Ukraine. This is why certain European countries, most notably France, have been advocating for the EU to move away from unanimity, especially before admitting new members. And this recent episode with Hungary will probably only exacerbate that anxiety. There are over 1.5 million non-profit organisations in the US, and millions more around the world. So how do you know which ones make the biggest impact with your donations? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They spend tens of thousands of hours poring over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-based organisations that are saving and improving lives. In fact, GiveWell has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like bed nets for as little as $5, which can reduce the number of malaria infections in impacted regions, and enough nets can lead to a significant drop in infections and thus boost life expectancy. Together, over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. In fact, in 2019, when we sold TLDR-branded pin badges for charity, we turned to GiveWell to help select the charities we donated to, ensuring the maximum impact of our giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. As such, you can find all their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Plus, if you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout. Do make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News in order to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.